It's been over a week since Russia refused to renew a deal allowing ships to safely carry grain from Ukrainian ports. Global wheat prices have spiked by as much as 15% over concerns about world food supplies. The European Union has said it's ready to move almost all of Ukraine's agricultural goods via road and rail through its territory. Moscow is stepping up its attacks on Ukrainian export infrastructure, and British intelligence warns of another Russian sea blockade.
Ukraine's Reni River port in flames, filmed from the Romanian side of the border. After repeated attacks on Odessa's Black Sea port, Russia has now begun targeting alternative export routes as well. On Monday, Ukrainian authorities reported several warehouses full of grain destroyed by drones in the Ukrainian port town on the Danube. Before Russia's invasion in 2022, Ukraine was the fourth largest exporter of grain, mainly wheat, corn, and barley, shipped via the Black Sea to countries such as Egypt, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. But with the start of its full-scale war, the Russian Navy blocked all grain exports from Ukraine's seaports. Food insecurity and soaring prices on the market were the result. A deal brokered by the UN and Turkey last summer allowed for limited exports. But last week, Russia pulled out of the agreement, leaving Ukraine and its allies yet again scrambling for solutions. Roughly 60% of Ukrainian grain already passes through so-called solidarity lanes, alternative land routes through EU member states bordering Ukraine. And there are plans to further increase capacity. Like here, in the Romanian port of Galați on the border. Ukraine uses a different rail track gauge than most of its European neighbors. But a dual track system is being extended in Galați to make deliveries across the border easier. And with the recent attacks on the Ukrainian ports, there may be more work here soon.
The signals from the Ukrainian side are there. 4 days ago, we had a meeting organized by the European and the Danube Commissions, where we discussed how both Brăila and Galați will be essential ports for transporting grains out of Ukraine, but not just only cereals.
Meanwhile, on the Black Sea itself, the Romanian port of Constanța has already become a major alternative route for Ukrainian grain. Since the beginning of this year, it has handled more than 15 million metric tons of grains, a 25% increase on the previous year. At the moment, there is additional capacity, the port director tells us, but this could change when Romanian farmers also start shipping their later harvest through Constanța.
The key to solve this problem is to increase the speed of the flow itself. So it means that on daily profile, on weekly profile, on monthly profile, by increasing the speed, making the movement of the grain more efficient, is increasing the quantities for both Romanian and Ukrainian farmers.
Whether by land or by sea, operators everywhere are seeking to increase capacity as the global grain prices continue to rise.
Johannes Peters is from the Centre for Maritime Strategy and Security in northern Germany. I asked him about the feasibility and higher costs of shifting so much grain to road and rail.
Prices will go up because the transport via rail or via the Danube River will be much more expensive than the sea transport. And the question is the EU or are all players capable in ramping up their capabilities, transport capabilities, but also their shipment capabilities? That will be the question, whether it will be possible to step in for the now lacking sea transport.
Well, there has been so much unity throughout this war from Europe. Some exceptions, but what do you think in this case? Do you think there will be unity?
Yes, but to a certain degree. So we do have an import ban actually for Ukraine grain, mainly due to pressure of states like Poland, for example, who were fearing dropping grain prices for the domestic farmers when a lot of Ukrainian grain will come on the European market. So it's not Ukraine is not possible to sell its grain on the European market. So the European market, the way through Europe, can only be a transit way. But the transit way prolongs the transport ways, and it increases prices. So I think we will see more pressure on grain prices.
Okay, apart from a transit way, what about a security escort through the Black Sea for Ukrainian ships still wanting to sail?
I think that's highly unlikely, actually, because the only player that would be able to provide escorts right now would be Turkey. But Turkey is a NATO member itself, and so I think the risk is quite too high that NATO gets involved into some kind of into the conflict, actually, and something NATO is trying to avoid since the beginning of the war.
Because there's no NATO presence in the Black Sea at the moment, is there?
There's no NATO presence in the Black Sea except Romania and Turkey. And opening the Black Sea for foreign states warships would also mean opening the Black Sea for Russian reinforcements from his northern fleets, for example.
So, Mr. Peters, where do you think this is all going to lead?
That's a tricky question, actually. So I think we will see more efforts to support Ukraine in exporting his grain via the Danube and via other ports in the Black Sea. I don't think that we will see escorts for grain ships exporting grain from Ukraine.
Mr. Peters, thank you very much for joining us here on DW, and thank you for the insights.
Let's get more on these shipping concerns with John Stoppard. He's the Senior Manager for Environment and Trade at the International Chamber of Shipping in London. Welcome to the program, sir. What do you make of Russia's threat to Ukraine-bound vessels? Do you take it seriously?
We've taken any security threat in the Black Sea very, very seriously, and all ships transiting through these waters are threat and risk assessing every aspect of the voyage. Whether Russia is serious about attacking merchant ships, innocent merchant ships, really remains to be seen. But it would be a huge escalation in terms of action taken by Russia. And it should also be remembered, Ukraine followed with a similar message about traffic in the northeastern Black Sea. We would condemn in the strongest terms anything that threatens the safety of navigation and the safety of our seafarers conducting their vital business.
What do you make of what we're hearing out of NATO? NATO is saying it's going to step up surveillance of the Black Sea region with patrol aircraft, with drones. Of course, there's talk about even using NATO ships as escorts, although that seems unlikely. Does any of that change to sort of the calculus that shippers are making when they're looking at the security threats and the dangers to them in the Black Sea?
Well, the NATO Shipping Centre is a very trusted partner in security for the shipping industry. It provides us with a huge amount of risk data, not just for the Black Sea, but for all of the regions in which NATO is present. In terms of stepping up their presence, I think it's worth remembering that there is no NATO mission in this region. There are NATO states involved, but any information we get from them will help in reassuring merchant shipping that it is safe to go about its business. Obviously, Ukraine has opened a corridor, but at the present time, nobody has accessed it for a number of reasons, which I'm sure we'll get onto. But any data we get on the threat profile, be that from mines, be that from kinetic action, be that from strikes against ports, but will be incredibly useful to shipping operating in the affected area.
Let's turn, though, for a moment to alternative routes. What do you make of them? We're hearing about the Danube, we're hearing about these land routes, rail. Are these effective ideas?
So the alternative routes have effectively been re-established and re-established the status quo ante from before the grain corridor was agreed. they are viable routes. They are supplying grain out of Ukraine. If you look at the vessel tracking information we have, you can see the glut of ships around the Danube that are accessing those alternative routes. But really, you do need to get bulk carriers in there to get the majority of this trade out of there, because in terms of volume, it's a massive difference.
Right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there for now. Unfortunately, John Stumpert, Senior Manager for Environment and Trade at the International Chamber of Shipping. Thanks for those views.
Thank you.
We can get more on this from Joseph Glauber. He's a Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and a former Chief Economist at the US Department of Agriculture. Welcome to DW. Let's start with those solidarity routes that the EU has instituted. Can they be upgraded to cope with the extra volume of Ukrainian grain that had previously been travelling by sea?
Well, one of the big unfortunate things that has happened over the last year is that Ukraine grain production has fallen considerably. Some of this is due, of course, to the fact that some of the land is occupied in war zone, but also because of the high cost of shipping through the solidarity lanes. That just means lower prices for Ukraine producers. Their production is down about 35-40% from 2 years ago. And I think at the volumes they're now producing and exporting, or ability to export, I think the solidarity lanes can potentially accommodate that, but again, at a higher cost than they would normally pay relative to their Black Sea ports.
Understood. And so how important are these grain exports to Ukraine and indeed to the rest of the world?
Well, let's start with Ukraine. I think the Black Sea is extremely important. They were able to get out all that grain that they had harvested in 2021, but hadn't been able to ship during the first few months of the war. The crops that were harvested in early summer, the wheat that was harvested early in the summer of 2022, and then of course the fall crops. There was real concern early last year that the stock levels would build up within Ukraine and they'd have to store on the ground. That thankfully didn't happen because of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Unfortunately, shipping out through the West, despite the improvements that were discussed in the earlier segment, which I think have been very, very helpful, it's very expensive. You have to truck and rail, get it to barge services. And as you know, this has caused tensions with those countries, not just because some of that product was being sold in Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and other places, but you are competing for barge services and rail services and port facilities. That drives up costs for everyone in the region, unfortunately.
So what then do you think is likely to happen?
Well, I think, unfortunately, when you talk about high transportation costs, selling into a world market where there's a lot of wheat in the world market right now, they have to compete with world prices. And so any additional costs in terms of getting wheat from Ukraine to Constanta is going to be borne by Ukraine producers in the form of lower prices. And unfortunately, I think that means even less incentives to plant wheat and maize and other things next year.
OK, so less production, higher prices. I'm aware that you've researched the impact of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Were you surprised that it lasted as long as it did?
Yeah, frankly, I was, and very pleased. I mean, obviously, it's meant a lot to get all that production out to the world. I mean, some attention has been made of, well, some of this is going to Europe or some of this is going to China. But again, more production in ending up in world markets means lower prices. And indeed, prices have been below pre-war levels since about the time the agreement came into force last year, that's all great news. But within 2 hours of the initial grain deal being signed back in August of 2022, there was a rocket attack on Odessa. So it's always been sort of touch and go. And Russia has, of course, tried to pull out of the agreement several times prior to this last time. And I think, when they announced on last Monday, a week ago, that they were discontinuing or terminating the agreement, I think a lot of people thought, well, they'll be back. And then, of course, the bombings and shellings that we've seen over the last week certainly have confirmed that, at least for the time being, that agreement's pretty dead.
Right. So who needs to promise Russia what for them to go back to it?
Yeah, it's hard. I think putting this all back into the bottle is going to be a trick. You know, what Russia has wanted, at least ostensibly what they've asked for, is access to the SWIFT banking system for their agricultural banks, which help finance imports for importing countries who are trying to buy their wheat and other products. And then the other thing has been reopening of the ammonia pipeline, which runs from plants on the Volga River. Ammonia and anhydrous ammonia is a fertilizer component. Those were typically, prior to the war, would run by pipeline down to Odessa to the port of Dvdeni. That's been of course, closed since the start of the war, and in fact, over the last couple of months, or 2 months ago, was actually damaged in an attack. Russia has wanted that reopened.
Right.
But apart from that, this just looks like, unfortunate, with the war, that the war itself is intensifying, and I think that's, this is an unfortunate casualty.
Thank you for that very clear analysis. Joseph Glauber from the International Food Policy Research Institute. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Now to Kenya, where food prices are soaring after Russia's decision earlier this month to pull out of a deal guaranteeing the safe export of grain through the Black Sea. The entire region is in the grip of the worst drought for decades. Hundreds of thousands depend on food aid. Organisations helping those in need are struggling to do their work. Here's DW's Felix Moringa.
Hannah Ekale is responsible for feeding 10 people, including her grandchildren. The kids help make these brooms to sell to a local shop. It's their only income. Selling 12 raises enough to buy a 3-kilo bag of maize flour. The family have no land. They fled their home during the 2008 post-election clashes in Kenya. Food aid helps, but no longer comes regularly.
We used to get aid twice a year. And then they brought stuff for us once a month. But then it stopped. We're still waiting for the next delivery. It's hurting us. We're just waiting to see if we'll get food or not.
William is Hannah's grandson. He studies hard. He'd love to become a doctor, but he says learning is hard on an empty stomach.
When I'm hungry, I can't concentrate. We rely on the little food they offer us in school. At least you can concentrate then. I stay in school and study for extra hours in the hope that when I get home, there'll be something. But when I get home, there's nothing and I have to sleep on an empty stomach and wake up hungry.
Hannah's cooking pots remain unused all day. This grain sack is now used to store utensils. The last time she cooked anything was last night. They'll eat again this evening, but there's nothing in between.
Hunger has become like a neighbor to us. It's always here. Even when we eat, we remain hungry. What else can we do? We don't have any other place to go or anything else we can do.
Hannah is concerned that without food aid, her children will continue going to bed hungry and they'll continue struggling with studies at school. The World Food Programme confirms that her concerns are valid, and unless there's an increase in donors and the Black Sea Grain Initiative resumes, then people like her will continue suffering with hunger. WFP Regional Director for Eastern Africa says suspension of the grain deal will have terrible consequences for the poorest.
People are going to reduce the size of the meals. They're going to cut meals. They're going to adopt alternative ways of trying to survive with less. And this is when malnutrition rates will increase. This is when hunger rates will increase. We're already in a bad situation. My fear is with the suspension of this deal, the situation could get worse.
Higher prices add pressure and uncertainty for Hannah and her family. They'll have to try to earn more just to survive. Decisions made a world away, making every day harder, and dreams seem even farther away.
Well, Brenda Kariuki can tell us more. She's Senior Regional Communications Officer for Eastern Africa with the World Food Programme's Eastern Africa Regional Office in Nairobi. Welcome to DW. So we're a week now since the Black Sea grain deal was halted. When and how do you expect to see its effects there in the Horn of Africa?
Thanks for having me. We hope it'll be resumed as soon as possible. We support and are hoping that the Secretary General's efforts to renegotiate the deal with Russia and Ukraine will make sure that we have the grain deal back on the plate. The longer it stays suspended, the more suffering we will see in the region, as at the moment, the Horn of Africa already is host to 23 million people who are food insecure. And the rise in food prices across the world will basically mean WFP has to procure more expensive wheat and other commodities, and that means reaching less people because our funding has also significantly reduced this year.
Right. So no, if I read you right, no effect yet, and you're hoping that the deal is resumed before you see this effect.
Well, if you look at the wheat market, I think the price went up to 14% as at yesterday. That's already a big leap from the time the grain deal was suspended. Before this grain deal was signed 1 year ago, the prices was high as 23%. And as soon as the deal was signed and we were able to access lower priced wheat at significant quantities, that price went down significantly. So already, once you start seeing the world prices of commodities like wheat going up, we can only tell it's a matter of time before that ripple effect hits this part of the country and the region.
Understood.
Where already we're recovering from drought and the hangover from COVID-19, and economies are struggling to just ensure that climate-induced drought that has rendered very many people unable to put a meal a day on the table.
So it's one thing after another. And are there alternative grain sources that the region can tap?
So WFP has in the past and continues to do at the moment look at alternative sources of commodities in the region. We've already procured in the past couple of years locally grown sorghum and maize and even vegetable oil from Kenya. So there are efforts already underway, but the quantities in the region are not as significant as what comes out of the Ukraine and the Russian wheat market.
Understood. We wish you well. Thank you for joining us. Brenda Kariuki from the World Food Programme.